All right, we're back talking about saturation today. Now, if you missed the last video, which I will link in the description, today we're kind of picking up right where we left off. So if any of this is a little confusing, just go catch that first video and then come back to this one. But what I want to do today is start applying saturation and give you some helpful tips about how to get the most out of your plugins. Now, what we're not going to talk about today is multiband saturation or parallel saturation, and we're also not going to talk about putting saturation on the mix bus. Those are all going to be topics for later videos. My main focus here is on showing you how much you can get out of free or very affordable saturation plugins. And at the end of the video, I am going to show a technique for achieving oversaturation. And what I mean by that is lots and lots of saturation without obvious distortion. It won't be as smooth or as easy as with some of the high-end plugins, but it's totally doable. But before we dive into applying saturation, I want to stress getting to know your plugins before you use them, so that's where we're going to start. One of the main things to consider before you start using your saturator plugins, and one of the reasons you want to get to know them, is simply to figure out what your input level needs to be. Here's a tip for saturators, and this might help you with other plugins as well. The input signal strength going into the plugin is crucial, especially on a saturator, for activating the drive. Now, if you ever turn on a saturator and you barely engage the drive and all of a sudden it's over distorting, it's because your signal strength is coming in too strong into the channel. And likewise, if you have to crank the drive way up before you get any response at all, then the input signal is too weak. So especially with saturators, it's really important to use the clip gain on your channel strip to make sure you get the input signal correct. And there's no magic number. It doesn't work the same for every plugin, but just so you know, if your saturator drive is engaging immediately, you need to turn down your input signal with your clip gain. If it's not engaging fast enough, you need to turn it up, because you want to be able to get to about the 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock range before you start to see harmonic increase. That said, this tape saturator is pretty interesting. If I crank up the drive there, that's at about 9 o'clock. I got a good amount of harmonics coming up over here. And now if I turn up saturate, I get a really nice harmonic response. I think most classic tape machines gave even harmonics. This one is strictly odd harmonics. I find the odd harmonics in this tape machine way more friendly than I find the odd harmonics in GSAT. The odd harmonics in GSAT bug my ears pretty quickly if I use too much of them, and I get that uncomfortable starting to sound out of key thing going on, where it sounds like I'm changing the pitch in an unfavorable way, and that is the problem to watch out for with odd harmonics. But this particular tape machine doesn't give me a lot of that unless I crank it up way too high. But that's Ferrix by Tone Boosters. This is a great little tape machine, and I'm pretty sure this is free or close to. So this one here is called Tesla SE by Variety of Sound, and this is a transformer saturator, and it is free. And this one is really cool because it gives you one big fat low harmonic. Your second harmonic there, which is an odd harmonic, and you can see the third harmonic creeping up at 500. So this transformer saturator is really useful for percussive instruments, especially for fattening up a snare or a tom or a kick drum. Let's actually run over and take a look at that applied real quick. Yeah, and you can see we're getting some perceived loudness there as a little bit of the transient is cut off, and it feels a little fatter and even a little brighter. So this is a great little plugin. You just turn it on, crank it up, and you get yourself a big fat harmonic in there. But what is this actually doing to the transient? That's the topic for the next video. The next video is going to be all about saturating transients. But this one is really cool. All right, and here's another one I wanted to show you. This is basically a stock tube EQ. And this is not marketed as a saturator, but as you can see, because it's a tube and it has a saturation drive, it does create harmonics for us. So if I crank up the warmth, you can see the first odd harmonic peak up. And if I turn up the saturation drive, now I have an even harmonic peaking up here at 200. I wanted to show you this just because you might have some plugins in your arsenal that you didn't know were creating overtones. Now here's another affordable plugin. This is called Fat Plus, and I use this all the time too. There's lots of little plugins out there like this, and they all have their place and they all have their own character. So I know this one's gonna give me some fat low harmonics, and it's not gonna mess with my upper frequencies too much. Now here's a multi-band distortion. This is one of the ones I have laying around that I never really use, but this one really illustrates the point where you want to use a spectrum analyzer to see what things are actually doing. Now, if I crank up the input drive on this guy, you could see those harmonics start to peak up there. There's quite a few, and this thing distorts things really hard, which is why I don't have much use for it, but I wanted to show you this. If I turn the treble drive all the way down, you see really no change in these harmonics. If I crank the treble drive all the way up, nothing happens. And same thing for the bass drive. The bass drive will change the amplitude, but it doesn't change my harmonics. All of the harmonic overtones being introduced into the signal are coming out of this mid drive. If I crank this mid drive up, it gives me a lot of harmonics. But if you didn't park this in a spectrum analyzer, you may not really know that your bass drive is not affecting bass harmonics or low harmonics, and your treble drive is not adding sheen and high-end harmonics up top. Yeah, always use a spectrum analyzer to see what you're working with. And this does have a little LFO, which gives you a nice warble if that's what you're after, which I guess is something to also be on the lookout for, because when you first turn this plug-in on, the LFO is set at about halfway, and if you didn't realize that, you might turn it on and hear this thing wobbling and go, oh wow, I don't need that. That doesn't sound good at all. But if you turn that down, it goes back to a plain steady sine wave here with harmonics. But yeah, this one, all the harmonics are coming from the mid drive. The treble and the bass don't do anything. So yeah, another real important reason to check these things before you use them. Now, the last one I want to show you real quick that we're going to be using today is this tube saturator by Shattered Glass Audio. It's their 1566. With this one, I have found that if I touch the gain and crank it up hardly at all, even with a modest input signal, it goes to work really hard, really fast. And you could see, look at all that high-end content that's popping up down there on the bottom right. This thing is powerful, and it's really distorting and cranking out harmonics. And it also has EQ functions if you want them, and 2x, 4x oversampling. But talk about harmonics there for a free saturator. This thing is cranking. Now, when you start to apply saturation, it's important to remember that you're introducing harmonics in one of two different ways. You can gently introduce harmonics if you want to think about it from the ground up, and you can do that without any clipping. The other way to introduce harmonics is to clip or trim off the top of the waveform, and that gentle distortion up there will create harmonics in a different way. So with character saturation or gentle saturation, what we're after is not too much clipping. We're after just introducing soft harmonics from the ground up. So let's get into that. So if I want to introduce some gentle harmonics from the floor up, I know that I can crank up my even harmonics and start increasing the input signal. And I'm going to level match here. And there you go. We've introduced some gentle harmonics from the floor up, and we're not creating harmonics by over clipping the tops of these signals. Now with GSAT here, I can engage the clipper, and we can listen to what happens when we create harmonics by trimming off the top of the signal, kind of the way a limiter does. Now we're creating harmonics by clipping the top of the signal, and if we overdo that, it's going to distort really fast and get ugly really quick. Let's do that. Now that kind of clipping distortion might be really pleasant in some circumstances, but in a lot of cases, it's not what you're after. It doesn't actually sound that bad on these things, but just so you're aware, that's the two different ways of creating harmonics when you apply saturation. You can really save yourself a lot of time. Instead of inching up to find the sweet spot, just crank it up and then dial it back. And that's all there is to it. I'm gonna go ahead and level match it a bit. So I'm not engaging the clipping. I got a little bit of distortion up there. I might dial it back a little more. So once you know what your saturator's doing, just crank it up and dial it back and find that spot where it seems to be operating best, giving you some introduction of harmonics, but not crushing your signal. And this is where you got to consider that you're probably not going to get everything out of any one instance of any one plugin that you want. If you want more saturation than this, then we're going to bring in another saturator. But let's bypass this so we can hear it without. And back on. Okay, that is what I'm considering my sweet spot. I'm not getting any obvious distortion. I'm not getting the intermodulation. I've just introduced a nice little bit of harmonics, and it's nice and subtle, but it's giving us that fatness and richness and warmth that we want from saturation. And the irony of saturation is, even though this subtle bit of saturation is technically distortion, it's actually adding a little bit of clarity. We perceive it as being clearer, even though it's very slightly distorted. That's one of the reasons we love saturation. So I'm going to call it good there, and I'm not going to try to get any more saturation out of this plugin. But now let's put a little tape on this. Crank up the drive too far, dial it back. And with this one, I know that the saturate knob and the drive knob both introduce harmonics, and so I'm going to want to experiment and find out how much of each one I want. Turn the saturate down and drive it up. Pretty nice. Drive down, saturate up. So crank them up, dial them back to find your sweet spot, and then experiment and figure out which blend of harmonic introduction you prefer for your tone. And so now we have two saturators going on here, and let's turn on a third one earlier on in the chain. This is Tesla just introducing the transformer low harmonics, and that's a bit much. Now let's listen to Tesla without the other two saturators on. And bypass. Back on. See, it doesn't take too much there where I'm getting it a little more distorted than I want. And I can start to hear some of that wobbly intermodulation, which I'm not really liking. So that's about as far as I'm going to push this one. And like I said, I've already looked at span, and I know what this is doing. It's giving me that fat first harmonic and maybe the little hint of the second harmonic. But that's all I'm going to try to get out of Tesla, and then GSAT and the tape. So there's all three of them. And we're going to add one more to the mix here. We're going to fatten this thing up with the Fat Plus here and get some more low, odd harmonics going. Going to crank up our input. And dial it back for finding our sweet spot here. All right, let's crank up the saturation. Crank up the input again, which on this plugin is equivalent to the drive. All right, let's bypass it. And back on. All right, we got a little bit of crunch going on there, but we're not shattering anything. We're not making anything super ugly. So there's 4 different saturators, all used modestly just on this subtrack of these 2 wah instruments here. And I'm going to bypass all of them, turn them all back on so we can hear the difference. Yep, very cool. So that is subtle character saturation, and that right there can take things to the next level. And these instruments now also sound a lot more like they're going through analog gear and getting gentle, natural analog saturation, which is really what we're after. It's a fuller, richer sound, and it's naturally compressed a little bit, and it's going to cut through a mix better. All right, now we're going to turn them all off in the mix and turn them back on. Yeah, very nice. So even with free saturators, you can accomplish quite a bit. Just don't try to crank any one plugin up too far. But that little bit there, it sounded great. Sounds a little bit more analog, sounds a little bit more natural, and saturation also takes care of a little bit of EQ work and compression work for us, and that's without doing anything else. That's just turning on 4 saturators and dialing in a sweet spot. Nice and simple. And now let's hop over to our blues shuffle and try to saturate that piano and see how we can get it to cut through the mix. All right, so our piano here has a left hand and a right hand. And what we're going to do is try to saturate them separately here. This SGA 1566 is a great example of not every saturator is useful in every situation. So as much as I like this thing, and I found a lot of great uses for it, at its lowest default settings, listen to what happens when I just turn it on this left hand of the piano. It's already distorting, and that's at its lowest settings. So I have to turn the input way down and adjust the gain and adjust the settings just to get this. Bypass. Back on. It's definitely adding harmonics, but I don't like it. And I don't think it's helping at all. But that's fine. You try something out, it doesn't work for this application, we try something else. So here's our Tesla, just adding low, odd harmonics. Crank it up too far and dial it back, look for a sweet spot. All right, now let's level match it. So that's kind of nice. We're getting some extra fatness from the extra harmonic. It's definitely helping us with a little compression. It's implying a nice tone, but I might not settle with it. I might keep moving, but that's really not the point. The point is, don't get stuck with any one tool. Just keep trying different ones until you find the best application. Now here's my trusty old tape machine we'll put on this left hand. Crank it up. All right, increase saturation. Dial it back. A little back. That's a pretty sweet spot right there. Let me turn on oversampling. All right, bypass. Back on. Yeah, I like that. That sounds great. You know, that little saturation's gonna help the left hand cut through the mix, no doubt. Now let's do the right hand. Let's try a little G-sat here and see if we can get some even harmonics going. All right, crank it up, dial it back. Yep, and pretty much back to zero. That's probably about where it sounds best. Now you can see the clip ceiling is engaging, which I really don't want, so I'm gonna turn the input down until that turns off, and then I can turn the output up. I'm gonna change the stages. This will add in more harmonics. Let's dial it up a notch. Another notch. So honestly, if I wanna use G-sat on the right hand here, that's about all I wanna push out of it. So I'm gonna try something else. All right, let's crank it up. And dial it back. Right, that sounds pretty good. Let's hear it in the mix. Piano's definitely cutting through the mix better, and we're off to a good start. All right, let's add a little saturation in on this guitar here. Let's start cranking up some harmonics. Dial back. All right, sounding pretty nice. I can actually handle a little bit of the odd harmonics coming out of G-sat on this without it sounding too ugly. And bypass. Back on. Now, if I bring the clipper in and start trimming off the top, it's going to give us more harmonics. Let's see how ugly it sounds. Yeah, not really what I want. But I can handle a little bit of it. That sounds pretty nice. So that's about all I would try to get out of this. Let's bypass it. Back on. But a little bit goes a long ways. That sounds pretty nice. Let's get some tape on here. Dial it back. Oversample. Let's turn this compression off. Turn the drive up a bit. And dial it back. All right, bypass. Back on. All right. So that's G-sat and some tape there. Let's hear it in the mix. All right, we'll turn them both off. Back on. Can you hear how that guitar sits in the mix better? It's still got some work to do, but that little bit is compressing it and filling it out a little bit, which is what we want from saturation. But turn them both off again. Back on. Nice. Yeah, but you get the idea. Now, I also saturated the bass and the drum bus and used the same techniques. Now we're going to turn all the saturation off and all of it back on so we can hear the difference. Yeah, so you can hear that even with a really quick job throwing some saturators on there, we made a really big difference. So don't be discouraged if you can only get your hands on some of the cheap or free saturators, because if you do it right, you can totally get a lot out of it. Adding harmonic content into your tracks is fantastic. It fills up the valleys and it shaves off a little bit of the peaks. And again, that'll be the topic of the next video, is specifically geared towards saturating transients. But before we leave the video today, I want to flush out that method of getting oversaturation without getting obvious distortion and getting it to sound real ugly. So we're going to hop back into our reggae jam and just really oversaturate something just for the sake of doing it, so we can just kind of flush it out and have some fun. This saxophone at the 200, 300 hertz range, where the lowest frequencies are, that's going to be where most of the energy is in this signal. You can see that up around 4 and 5K on the graph, there's quite a bit up there, but just by the nature of the lower frequencies, they take more air to push, so to speak. They take more energy to amplify. That's what's hitting your saturator first. The saturator is going to be responding to this information that's down below 500 here. So now, the important thing to know about that is if you wanted to cater your saturation to specific frequencies, you can EQ before you hit the saturator, and you could kind of drive your harmonic overtone content out of the saturator the way you want by determining what you EQ into it. And we can do this over and over and over and really create a whole new sound that's completely oversaturated, but we can kind of keep the unpleasant artifacts under control by doing this. So this is really just more of a fun experiment than anything, but I wanted to show you the method. So for our first instance, we're going to take down some of the high stuff, and this is going to be an EQ before our first saturator. I'm going to take down more. And then when you do this, you're going to change the wave shape so much that you're going to have to correct after each saturation. So let's try that. That's our first EQ. And then our first saturator is the Tesla, and we're going to add in these low harmonics. Dial it back till the obvious distortion starts to go away. We look for our sweet spot. And now after that instance, we're going to bring some of that high information back up. And we're going to let that hit the next saturator. Dial it back a bit. All right, this is what's going to hit the next saturator. And dial it back. It's a little too ugly. Bypass. Back on. All right, with the next EQ, we're going to take some high out and we're going to encourage some more mids to get saturated. And then we're going to add some tape after that. All right, bypass. Back on. Get a little more out of that. And then with the last EQ, we're going to try to recover our sound. And then we've added our tube EQ at the end, adding some more harmonics and kind of reshaping the sound. So let's take a listen to this entire chain of driving the saturators with the frequencies we want. We ended up using 5 different saturators and EQs. We just did all of this really quickly, but let's do again a before and after and take a listen. Here's the original dry sax. And with everything on. You can really hear how much we've pumped into there without any crazy obvious distortion or bad artifacts. Yeah, super warm and fuzzy. Let's hear it in the mix. That's a super saturated saxophone, but it's not crazy, crunchy, distorted either. It actually sounds kind of nice. It's definitely a bit much, but if you were going for something super saturated, that's one method you can try. So I just wanted to lay that out for you. Stacking EQs and saturators and driving your saturators intentionally with EQs is actually a really powerful tool, and it's better than trying to super crunch something out. You know, it'd be easy enough to just throw some distortion on the sax and just completely wreck it. But if you're after super saturation that still sounds relatively pleasing, give this method a try. You might like it. But there you go. I just wanted to lay all that out for you. Get to know your plugins, put them on a sine wave, and get them in a spectrum analyzer so you know how each of the controls work and what they're doing. And then you can also kind of test your plugins to see if they're doing what they claim to be doing. And when you start applying saturation in your mix, change it up, change the settings. If your saturators offer different algorithms, try them out. If something isn't working for you, just yank it and try another one. At the end of the day, you're just going to have to experiment, but you'll save yourself a lot of time and trouble if you take the time to research your plugins before you start hitting things and saturating them. And the main point there is not to try to get too much out of one plugin. Just look for that sweet spot and call it a day. Just move on. And if you need more saturation, try a different plugin. It's a great opportunity to stack saturators and get different tones and colors out of it. Because not every saturator is good for every application. You're going to find that some of your saturators are only good for very specific things, and some of them tend to work pretty well in a lot of situations. I hope this sparks some creativity for you, and I hope you want to get in and start playing with saturators. And don't be shy, crank them up and dial them back and look for the sweet spot and have a good time, because this is one of the best ways to fill out your mix, and there's never been a good mix out there that wasn't saturated to at least a certain degree. Anyway, thanks for checking that out, and I'll catch you on the next one.